That historic agreement will be commemorated this week in Mexico. It's a deal that led to a fall in U.S. manufacturing jobs, a warning critics say they predicted. But one industry has seen growth more than double over the past 20 years. Roza Kazan is in Chicago with that part of the story. Roza?
That's right, Annan. Well, back in 1992, when NAFTA was still being debated, U.S. President Bill Clinton, then presidential candidate Bill Clinton, made NAFTA a cornerstone of his campaign. But one of his opponents, Ross Perot, said that the net result of NAFTA was going to be, quote, a giant sucking south going south. And that by that, he meant that tons of jobs will be heading from the United States to Mexico. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way for U.S. farm exports, and especially the country's booming pork industry.
Today I'm going to prepare a pulled pork sandwich.
Kenneth Robinson, the chef of the Pork Chop restaurant in Chicago, says Americans love their pork, and they're not inclined to waste any part of a pig.
The pork belly, spare rib, pork chop, a pork tenderloin, the inners, which is the intestines, the ears, the snout. I mean, you can use the whole thing. Americans will always eat pork.
But the numbers say otherwise. Over the last 2 decades, pork consumption in the U.S. grew just 1%, while pork production rose by more than 1/3. So where did all of that pork go? The answer is overseas.
Virtually all that's being exported. That extra 30% or so is being exported. It's not being consumed domestically.
And a lot of it shipped just south of the border to Mexico. In fact, U.S. pork exports to Mexico and Canada have risen tenfold over the past 2 decades. Mexico is now the second biggest importer of U.S. pork after Japan. Mike Wolfman says that's exactly how NAFTA was supposed to work and should keep on working.
If an industry is going to grow, if our industry is going to grow, it's really going to have to come out of export market.
But NAFTA, by some estimates, has cost Mexico more than 1 million farm jobs. But Phil Levy, former trade advisor to U.S. President George W. Bush, justifies that as the cost of competition. The more efficient producer won.
Yes, trade brings competition, and for those who come up on the short end of that competition, it can be painful. On the other hand, there are other things they can do, not easy, not immediate, but there are things, and there's a lot of people who benefit. Those who are consuming the products.
But while U.S. farmers appreciate the access NAFTA has given them to Canadian and Mexican markets, they also realize relying too much on exports for growth could be potentially dangerous.
If you live and die by an export market and something happens to one or many of them, it can be very, very bad for prices.
And that prediction that U.S. presidential candidate Ross Perot made all those years ago?
There will be a giant sucking sound going south.
It turned out to be a hot, sizzling sound instead. And if you measure the success of NAFTA by the degree to which it encouraged trade between the 3 countries, it has certainly achieved its results. If you take a look at these numbers over here, it shows that U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico rose 200 and 370% respectively. And while it's not as stellar as the exports in the pork industry, which, as I mentioned, rose tenfold, it's still a pretty good number.
So, Roza, what are the other pluses that supporters of this agreement point to?
Well, Anand, they point to the fact that U.S. producers have been essentially protected, shielded, if you will, from Canada or Mexico unilaterally raising trade barriers, such as imposing tariff import duties on U.S. products, to protect the industries, for example, in the time of crisis, which is what happened in the late 1990s with many countries right after the Asian financial crisis, and more recently during the recent global economic downturn. They also point to the fact that during Bill Clinton's presidency, right after when NAFTA was enacted during his first term, the U.S. economy was doing so well, the unemployment was so low that there was a threat of inflation. And they're saying that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing that some of the jobs went to Mexico.